They said they feared nothing, not gods, not death, not destiny. But that's a lie. Beneath the iron and legend, the Vikings were terrified. Of the dead, of the gods, and of the fate they believed they could never escape. What if the warriors, who conquered half the known world, weren't driven by bravery, but by fear? Fear of spirits that walked at night. Fear of divine hunger that demanded blood. Fear that even in death, the soul could still be enslaved. For centuries, the Viking Age has been remembered as a time of glory. Fearless raiders, pagan kings, and an honor code carved into stone. But behind the myth of Viking raids and longships lies a civilization far darker and more fragile than we ever imagined. This is not the story of adventure, it's the story of control. How faith, slavery, and superstition held an entire culture in their grip. Tonight, we'll unearth the world they tried to bury. This isn't the saga of noble heroes. It's the anatomy of fear, of a people who thought they could master death, only to find themselves enslaved by it. Tonight, we peel back the legend to reveal what truly kept the Vikings awake at night. Please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share it with a friend. It matters to us more than you think. Let us begin. Noble raiders or ruthless slavers? They sang of courage, but their ships carried chains. For centuries, the world has admired the truth about Viking raids as tales of bold exploration and fearless conquest. We picture longships slicing through cold seas, men with braided beards and bright axes descending upon coastal towns. Yet behind the romantic glow of those sagas lies something far darker. An empire built not on honor, but on Viking slavery and fear. According to historian Neil Price, the Viking world was a civilization of the unfree. Archaeological evidence suggests that up to 1 in 5 people across Scandinavia were enslaved. Real-life Viking slaves taken from villages in Ireland, England, and the Baltics, sold like cattle across vast slave markets in Viking Age Europe. These weren't isolated atrocities, they were logistics. The Viking economy ran on human lives. Silver coins from the Islamic Caliphate flowed north in exchange for captives. The slave markets in Viking Age towns like Hedeby and Birka were international hubs, places where language, identity, and even names were stripped away. A thrall wasn't a person, they were a unit of trade, a body with a price tag. The word thrall, once meaning slave, still echoes through Nordic languages today. It was these captured souls, women, children, the defeated, who fed the Viking economy, built their farms, and even died in their rituals. But here lies the contradiction that defines this age. How did a people who worshipped courage also practice Viking human trafficking on an industrial scale? The sagas, written centuries later, quietly skip over these details. Yet Arabic traveler Ibn Fadlan's Viking account from 921 AD doesn't flinch. He describes ships filled with merchandise and girls bound for trade on the Volga River. He witnessed Viking slave sacrifice, women strangled and burned beside their dead masters as gifts to the afterlife. To the Vikings, this wasn't cruelty, it was destiny. They believed in word, the unchangeable weave of fate that bound gods and mortals alike. If you were born free, you would remain free. If born enslaved, the gods themselves had decreed it. This fatalism gave order to horror, a divine logic that made mercy meaningless. What kind of faith demands the death of those who served you in life? Norse sacrifice rituals were never just spiritual offerings. They were power made visible. Scholars like Anders Winroth reveal that such acts reinforced the Viking social hierarchy, reminding both free and enslaved where they belonged. Even death offered no escape. Viking afterlife fears suggested that a slave's soul could be bound to their master forever, trapped between worlds. To the outside world, the Vikings were fierce pagans seeking glory, but within their own settlements, they were haunted by the fear of rebellion, curses, and vengeance from those they chained. Some graves even show signs of mutilation. Viking graves disturbed, limbs broken post-mortem, iron nails driven through flesh. Archaeologists believe this was to prevent the enslaved dead from returning as Viking drog or undead, restless spirits that rose from dishonor or injustice. If this reframes how you see history, consider subscribing, because the story only gets darker from here. Let's continue. Buried with fear, the Viking undead. They didn't fear dying. They feared coming back. Across the icy lands of Scandinavia, beneath the soil of forgotten farms and pagan shrines, archaeologists keep finding the same haunting signs. Broken bones, decapitated corpses, stones wedged in mouths, and iron stakes driven through the chest. These were not enemies punished after death. These were members of their own communities, people their families once loved and later feared. According to archaeologist Terry Gunnell, such graves reveal the Vikings' terror of the Viking Draugr undead, spirits of the restless dead who refuse to stay buried. Unlike the ghosts of Christian myth, Draugr were physical, violent, and hungry. They rose to punish betrayal, injustice, or improper burial. To the Vikings, these weren't random hauntings, they were moral verdicts. Every corpse that refused to rest was a conscience that refused to forget. The Viking fear of undead wasn't superstition, it was theology. It shaped how they built their graves, how they buried their dead, and how they imagined eternity itself. In the sagas, the Draugr were described as grotesque and swollen, eyes glowing, skin pale as frost. But scholars suggest something deeper, that these stories were moral codes disguised as horror. The undead symbolized guilt made flesh, a society's sins clawing back from the soil. Norse afterlife beliefs reflected a people obsessed with order, where even the dead had a place, and stepping outside that order meant damnation. And when that balance was broken, fear took physical form. Graves show evidence of ritual dismemberment and burning. Norse ritual murder performed to sever a soul's return path. Some graves even reveal repeat burials, bodies exhumed, reburned, and buried again, as if the living feared the memory of the dead more than the dead themselves. One expert on the period, Marianne Moen, believes these rites were a desperate blend of religion and psychology, an attempt to control a terror no weapon could slay. But what if those rituals weren't only to contain the dead, but to confess the living? What sins did these people fear might return to them in the dark? Here lies the contradiction that still unsettles historians. A society that glorified courage, yet filled its burial grounds with traps for corpses. From Viking skull trophies to Viking death superstitions, every symbol of bravery was shadowed by dread. What does it say about a civilization when it trusts iron more than prayer? According to historian Jon Vidar Sigurdsson, these beliefs reveal a culture of anxiety, a civilization that could conquer the world, but not its own guilt. Beneath every longhouse, under every mound, the Vikings buried more than bodies. They buried memory, vengeance, and the weight of what they had done. And yet, not all their dead were feared. Some were revered, their graves transformed into shrines, their deaths into symbols of divine power. Next, we enter that boundary between faith and fear, where language itself became a weapon, and even words could bind the soul. The language of the dead. They carve their prayers into bone, not to remember, but to bind. Before the church bells rang across the north, there was only silence, broken by the sound of blades carving symbols into wood, stone, or flesh. The Vikings believed words themselves held power. Every rune was alive, carrying meaning that could bless, curse, or command. To write was to summon. To speak was to shape reality. The runes were never just an alphabet. They were a spell system, a bridge between the world of men and the realm of spirits. The act of carving a name was both creation and control. Some stones bear inscriptions designed to trap the dead, others to protect the living. Archaeologists have even found runes buried face down. Silenced magic meant never to be spoken aloud. This was the domain of saga, a forbidden art of sorcery practiced mostly by women, though a few men dared. The practitioners, called voleurs, entered trance states to communicate with spirits or weave fate itself. They were both revered and reviled. The sagas described them as wrapped in animal skins, whispering into the void, their eyes rolled white, their voices echoing with something not entirely human. What kind of courage does it take to speak with the dead, knowing they might answer? Cider was feared because it reversed the order of power. It gave a voice to the powerless, women, slaves, outcasts, to shape destiny through secret means. Yet for men, it was taboo. To practice it was to surrender masculine honor, to risk contamination by the supernatural feminine. As Gross Steinsland notes, Zida was a mirror. It showed the gods the price of their own knowledge. The root of this fear was the Norse idea of word, fate as a web that even the gods could not escape. Odin himself hanged from the world tree for 9 nights to glimpse the rune's secrets, bleeding for wisdom he could never truly control. In that cosmology, choice was an illusion. Every death, every sacrifice, every cruelty was part of a pattern already woven. To the Viking mind, magic wasn't rebellion against the gods. It was submission to their design. When a sacrifice was made, it wasn't a crime. It was the continuation of destiny. And that destiny demanded blood. Next, we enter the ceremonies where life became an offering. Sacrifice in the name of the gods. They believed every drop of blood could buy favor from the divine, even if it wasn't their own. For centuries, the sagas told of feasts, mead, and glory in the halls of Odin. But archaeological evidence paints a darker picture. Beneath the remains of ancient temples in Uppsala, Ribe, and Lejre, excavations have revealed pits filled with human bones, animal skulls, and ritual blades. These were no accidents of burial. They were deliberate offerings, Norse sacrifice rituals designed to appease gods who demanded more than prayers. When a chieftain died, a slave girl volunteered, or was chosen, to join him in the next world. She was washed, adorned with jewelry, paraded through the camp, and intoxicated. Then, in a scene almost too disturbing to believe, she was strangled and stabbed before being placed beside her dead master, their bodies burned together as a wedding gift for the afterlife. Scholars like Elsa Rosdahl confirm that this description aligns with Nordic burial customs of the 10th century, blending myth, power, and control into one act of worship. It was not seen as murder, it was sanctified union. The Viking female slaves offered in death were told they would serve in paradise, their agony transformed into divine purpose. In the Norse mind, devotion and domination were one. Women held a paradoxical power, sacred yet disposable. As Viking concubines, they were both symbols of fertility and tools of ritual purity. Every offering carried an unspoken message. The gods demanded beauty and blood in equal measure. The Vikings believed that sacrifice could bridge the mortal and the divine. Blood, human or animal, was a language the gods understood. At the midwinter blot festivals, entire communities gathered to offer horses, cattle, and sometimes people to ensure victory in raids or good harvests. As noted by historian Anders Vinroth, these acts weren't just religious, they were political theater, reinforcing the authority of the Viking warrior code and the hierarchy that bound slaves to masters, women to husbands, and men to gods. From the perspective of historian Judith Jesch, the Viking gods were mirrors of their society, capricious, demanding, and easily angered. To displease them risked ruin. To feed them meant survival. The Viking religious fear that pulsed through these sacrifices wasn't mere piety. It was existential dread, a belief that the world itself could collapse if the gods were not satisfied. And yet, beneath that fear was obedience. Obedience to word, to a destiny none could resist. In this universe, even cruelty was sacred, and mercy was blasphemy. But fear can only hold a society together for so long. Eventually, blood was not enough. Next, we enter the moment when the axe fell, not in sacrifice, but in silence, when the gods of the north began to die and their worshippers were forced to choose between faith and survival. The silence after the axe. The temples burned quietly. The gods didn't scream, but their believers did. By the late 10th century, the world of Odin was dying. Across Norway, Denmark, and Iceland, wooden shrines once dark with the smoke of Norse sacrifice rituals were torn down and replaced with churches. Stone crosses rose where sacred groves had stood for centuries. To later historians, this moment was a triumph of civilization over barbarism, the dawn of Christianity in the north. But to those who lived it, it felt like the end of the world. When you hear of a faith erased, do you think something sacred was lost, or something dangerous? Share your view in the comments. As documented in the work of historian Sverre Bagge, conversion to Christianity wasn't a peaceful enlightenment, it was a war of annihilation. Kings like Olaf Tryggvason and Olaf Haraldsson imposed the new faith by fire and sword. Those who refused baptism were severely punished or killed. Pagan priests were executed, idols destroyed, sacred wells filled with corpses. The Viking religious fear that once kept the old gods alive now turned inward. Terror that the new god's wrath might follow those who still whispered Odin's name. The purges were not only physical, they were linguistic. Runes were outlawed as pagan witchcraft. Old inscriptions were chiseled out of stones. Entire alphabets and the identities tied to them were erased. Language itself became a battlefield, where every word of the old faith risked eternal damnation. Yet the sagas, written long after the blood had dried, speak of something more haunting: silence. The silence of people who had built their lives on Viking afterlife beliefs, suddenly told that Valhalla was a lie. The silence of families who once buried their dead with charms against the Viking Draga undead, now commanded to forget those rituals. The silence of women who lost their roles as seeresses, healers, and intermediaries between the worlds. From the perspective of scholar Gro Steinsland, the fall of the Norse gods was not just a theological shift. It was a psychological collapse. The Viking warrior code that glorified battle and blood was replaced by guilt, humility, and sin. For a people raised to meet death with laughter, the promise of eternal submission in heaven was a living death in itself. Archaeological traces tell the story wordlessly. Temples buried beneath chapels, carved runestones hastily reused in church walls, crosses inscribed beside Odin's runes as if hedging a spiritual bet. As one culture rose, the other was entombed beneath it, layer by layer, like a conquered enemy. And yet, even in this enforced conversion, something refused to die. Old prayers were whispered beneath new hymns. Odin's wolves became saints' beasts, his ravens angels. Beneath the sermons, the pulse of the old world still beat, faint but defiant. The conversion didn't end fear, it merely redirected it. The dread of Odin's wrath became terror of sin, and the wild freedom of Valhalla turned into obedience under heaven. For a civilization once defined by fate and freedom, this was exile from its own soul. But centuries later, those buried symbols would rise again, not in worship, but in weaponry. Next, we'll uncover how the Viking gods were resurrected, not by priests, but by politicians, soldiers, and extremists who turned myth into identity and faith into ideology. Echoes of blood in modern myths. They wore the gods again, not as faith, but as armor. Centuries after the last Viking temple fell, the symbols of Odin and Thor began to return. But this time, they weren't carved on altars. They were printed on flags, etched into tattoos, and sewn onto uniforms. The truth about Viking raids, long softened into legend, was reborn as propaganda. What began as a mythology of survival became a mythology of supremacy. According to historian Tom Shippey, the modern obsession with the Vikings began in the 19th century, when Scandinavian nationalism and German Romanticism sought noble ancestors to glorify empire. Writers painted the Norse as pure, fearless, and free, conveniently forgetting the Viking slave trade, Viking human trafficking, and the brutal Viking social hierarchy that kept thousands in chains. These stories weren't about truth. They were about identity, about reclaiming power through myth. But this resurrection came with a curse. Myths once used to control slaves were now used to control nations. The gods of war were reborn as emblems of racial purity. Runestones became political symbols. The Norse dead had returned, not from graves, but from propaganda. By the 20th century, those same myths had turned poisonous. Scholars like Stefan Brink note that Nazi ideologues reinterpreted Viking afterlife fears and the Viking warrior code as proof of racial destiny. Odin's warriors became symbols of Aryan strength. The Viking shieldmaidens myth was twisted into a fantasy of purity and sacrifice. History was no longer studied, it was engineered. And even today, the echoes continue. Online forums, extremist groups, and nationalist movements still brandish runes and ravens, invoking Norse afterlife beliefs not as spirituality, but as rebellion. To them, Valhalla isn't a paradise, it's a slogan. Yet for archaeologists and historians, this revival is both fascination and warning. According to Professor Neil Price, the Viking past is not a mirror of who we were, but a weapon for those who decide what we should become. Modern culture has romanticized the Vikings as anti-heroes, rebels against order, avatars of freedom. But freedom in the Viking world was a privilege built on captivity. Beneath every horned helmet in pop culture lies the silent face of a slave, a widow, a sacrifice. When we glorify their rage and courage, we risk resurrecting their cruelty too. Every generation resurrects its own Vikings. In films, games, and nationalist movements, the helmets shine again, but the chains remain invisible. The danger lies not in remembering the past, but in mistaking its brutality for strength. And the Vikings weren't alone in this. Centuries before them, Sparta forged its own myth of perfection, a warrior society that preached freedom while enslaving its neighbors, that celebrated courage while silencing compassion. Both cultures taught their sons to kill without hesitation, and their daughters to endure in silence, believing discipline could purify fear. But beneath the armor of honor lay the same terror of weakness, of rebellion, of the self. Perhaps that's why we keep returning to them. Vikings and Spartans, bound by legend, admired for the very cruelties they could not escape. Because their stories aren't just history, they're mirrors. They show us how easily ideals become cages, how strength becomes ritual, how faith becomes control. As historian Elsa Rosdahl once wrote, the Vikings never truly vanished, they only changed their gods. The same could be said of Sparta. Its ghosts live on wherever discipline is worshipped more than humanity. And perhaps that's the truest curse of them all. Not the Draga, not the gods, but our need to mythologize our own cruelty. The Vikings believed fate was unchangeable, that every act was part of a story already written. Maybe that's why their legends and Spartas still return, because we keep rewriting them, hoping this time the ending will be different. But some stories refuse to end. If you want to see how another civilization turned fear into faith, watch our next documentary, Sparta, Fear Beyond the Myth of Discipline. Like, share, subscribe. Good night.